Welcome to WorkRise Shorts. My name is Megan Tackney, and I'm the Director of Partnerships and Engagement at WorkRise, a research to action network hosted at the Urban Institute. We have a great conversation lined up today with Jennie Romich, and she is the Director of the West Coast Poverty Center at the University of Washington. We'll be diving into their latest research that thinks about the effects of minimum wage on younger workers and less experienced workers across Seattle, Washington. Jennie, and thank you for being with us today. My first question to you is, what exact problem were you hoping your research to take on or solve?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Megan, and I appreciate the role that WorkRise plays in bringing research and practitioners together and supporting research. So, thank you. Now, as to the exact problem that my research was addressing, this work is started with a social kind of policy problem and then also developed a technical problem along the way. So I'll talk a little bit about both. This work actually originated about a decade ago when Seattle passed the city level $15 minimum wage ordinance. And I was part of a large group of researchers who were interested in lots of different effects of this. The one part that I and some students have carved out is thinking in particular about how the city level minimum wage affects young workers, teenage workers or youth in their early 20s. And I see this as a larger question about how do early disparities in the labor market start. I'm a poverty researcher, as you said, by training, and I particularly worry about workers who are at risk of some type of economic marginalization. So youth from lower income families, youth from families who have been historically excluded from the labor market. So kind of interested in those questions. The technical part of this work comes about because we didn't have the data to look at that. Because this was a city level minimum wage, even though it's a large city, the standard survey data like CPS data or American Community Survey data that people have used to look at other minimum wage laws, we couldn't look at because we didn't have enough observations inside Seattle. Our larger teams, some of my colleagues on our larger team use data from the state unemployment insurance system to look at overall wage impacts, but this unemployment insurance UI data doesn't tell you anything about the workers. So we had this technical problem to solve, which was how do we get data that has worker demographics and can also tell us about workplace dynamics. And so that's kind of where this work started, and we approached the policy question. We could only approach that after we had gone through the technical work to put the other data together.
And where are you now? What are your research findings so far?
There I'll start with the technical. So it took us about 8 years to work with I think 7 or so different state agencies to put together a longitudinal integrated data set. So we combined data from the state unemployment insurance system with data from state driver's license and state voter records, human services records, and birth certificate records from the State Department of Health. We commissioned a group at the state who does a lot of data integration to build us that data set. They did the initial work on it, and then we've done a lot of kind of post-processing and understanding the strengths of this work. And so the key finding from that is one that sounds boring and nerdy, but is actually for people who are into boring and nerdy is super excited, super exciting, which is we can really do a good job of replicating a full population data set using state administrative sources. So we compared our data to the 2010 census data. And one thing we looked at was geographical coverage, and at the census block level, so super fine, we had about a 91% correlation with what the census saw. And we kind of view that as neither party was really ground truth. We think there are situations where the administrative data that we put together probably does a better job than census data, and vice versa. We also did a lot of work trying to compare the earnings records. And one thing that I think is an important aspect of using the merged unemployment insurance and other records is we do a lot better job tracking people who are very low earners over the course of the year. So for people who earn $5,000 or fewer over the course of the year, we pick up a lot more of those people as earners than show up in the American Community Survey. And so if you were looking at populations who are at risk of being economically marginalized, whether it's very young workers or workers without stable housing, or workers with severe health problems who maybe have very intermittent work, the administrative data does a better job. So after 8 years of putting that data together, we finally got onto the project of trying to understand what happened to young workers when the city of Seattle raised its minimum wage. And I will say a caveat on this work is it's not yet peer reviewed. We're presenting it at the APAM conference this fall. But it's not peer reviewed, and but we've also been doing it enough that we know the results are pretty stable to different models. So what we're finding is that in the initial quarter after the minimum wage went into effect, you see slight dips in employment, earnings, and hours for young workers. But these effects are really transitory. For the next year and a half, there are no significant effects on employment and no significant effects on earnings. So if you ask what was the impact of the Seattle minimum wage on workers age 16 to 24, no effects other than a little bit of initial dip. But the hours effect persists. So we found that over the year and a half follow-up, young workers were working a little bit less per week, somewhere in the vicinity of a half an hour to an hour less, but they weren't earning less, which makes sense that if you're working slightly fewer hours, but your wage went up, I mean, the maths there. So we think of that as potentially a good thing for young workers who are also likely in school or pursuing training or trying to get established in other parts of their life. So working slightly fewer hours without losing incomes might help them spend more time on education or family.
I mean, to stay on that for a second, then, when you think about these preliminary findings, what communities do you think will be most impacted by them?
That's an interesting question for the minimum wage, because the people who passionately debate it tend to be economists and policymakers and other social scientists. And the people who are affected by it are low-wage workers. So, I think in terms of kind of who are the grassroots kind of people most affected by the topic, that's workers themselves. But that's kind of an abstract thing for the research. On the issue of, or back to the technical part of this about creating the full population, one surprising thing we realized that we didn't go into this thinking about was that the ability to replicate census level coverage or kind of full population coverage and link it to economic policies and to follow people over time does make a lot of communities who aren't visible in national survey data much more visible. So we actually have, one student who I'm working with at the University of Washington studies. He's Pacific Islander. He's Chamorro, native Guamean. And he studies kind of data gaps and representation around Pacific Islanders. In Washington State, I think the Seattle area, I saw recently, the Seattle metro area has the third largest Pacific Islander population outside of Hawaii. So kind of on the mainland. And so that's an important population locally, but you never see, Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian represented in kind of major survey data about economic things. So one of the things that we're doing over the next year is talking to people from the Pacific Islander community in Washington State kind of about this data and about how they would like to see their community represented. We're working with the state and hopefully going to be creating a version of data that's like this going forward. And there's just this ability to have people who are impacted kind of by the representation in this. Asian American subgroups, Native Americans, Alaska Natives are also groups who are often left out of national economic studies that are based on survey data. And we're hoping to do similar processes where our group engages with representatives from those communities who think about research, who think about describing using data the needs and strengths of their communities. So that's kind of a future direction, I guess, but one I'm really excited about.
So that is one change that obviously, as it relates to the collection of survey data, the behavior of governments and other sort of research institutions. Are there other actors you'd want to call out that you hope would take this research and create change?
Yeah, well, I do. On the technical thing, we're hoping to get support for creating this administrative data resource going forward. We've had some initial strong reception from the state. We've gotten some funding from the state legislature and have had a number of the relevant agency heads have signed on to a letter of intent to help us plan this. So we're hoping we can do that. There are a lot of tricky parts of that puzzle. But on the social policy side, back to the question of the minimum wage, I think once you have the data and you have kind of the right set of methods to look at these questions, you're still not going to have clean answers. And one thing as a scholar, as I observe policymakers and advocates and interest groups talking about the minimum wage is a real kind of zero-sum thinking where like if anything at all bad happens, then the whole policy is bad. And I would love to see more nuance in that conversation, like the idea that you could say, yes, we're going to raise wages and a lot of workers are going to be better off and a few workers are not going to be better off. And that's still an okay thing to do. I think there's, sometimes I get flippant with my language and I kind of say this is like progressive fragility around this, that like there's a counter theory that raising the minimum wage would actually cause only positive impacts. And, I understand that theory. But it then becomes, I think, a debate where on one side they say, see, something bad happened, it's a bad policy. And on the other side, they say, we don't think anything bad happened, or, you know, we're going to criticize your research instead of acknowledging, yes, you could have something bad and it could still be very much a policy we'd want to support. So, you know, like a researcher, I'm calling for more nuance and a more complicated story, which is
Nuance and complicated stories are what we need research for and the world we live in. So that's it for all of our questions today, Jennie. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing our work. We look forward to seeing the full research come out. And this research can be found on WorkRise's website as well as at the West Coast Poverty Center. So thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks for the conversation.